Truly, Darren Walker brings worlds and people together. A word that one encounters over and over when talking with people about Darren and reading about Darren and thinking about Darren's work is empathy. It's a word that he uses often himself and that he lives, as is made vivid by the vast universe of his friendships and the trajectory of his career. And it is manifested in his actions, large and small, that aim to bring people together across lines of class and race and circumstance. Empathy, in Darren's understanding, does not deny history, but has the courage to move forward in full acknowledgement of both the grievous fallibility of so evident in our past and our present, and at the same time, the potential that we can create a better future. Empathy can take material form in the physical settings of our lives. We've invited architect Vishaan Chakrabarti, Detroit Planning and Development Director Maurice Cox, and Studio Museum Director and Chief Curator Thelma Golden to talk about Darren's contributions to New York, to architecture, to cities, to art, to our world, as seen from their own arenas of action. Please join me in welcoming Vishaan Chakrabarti.
Hello, everyone. Enduring words come to mind when describing my dear friend of many decades, Darren Walker. Gregarious, luminous, eponymous, a vision of sartorial splendor. But the description I like to conjure the most comes from yet another friend from a different context, which is to think of Darren as an interpreter of maladies. This is because few understand what ails us as a culture as much as Darren. Few understand the asymptote to which we collectively aspire, as does Darren. Darren helps us understand our daily failures and our true aspirations as a society. But he does this without judgment, without rancor, without divisiveness. He does it with love. Which is why in the building of architecture, of cities, of communities, he always tries to guide us towards the most righteous outcome. Once years ago, in a simple Saturday email exchange, a debate really, about the inclusivity of the High Line, he convinced me, with grace and with gravity, that we could have done better. Or when we approached Darren about the inequity of building a brand new train station for the wealthiest users of Penn Station, but with few planned improvements for everyday commuters, he immediately, without question, rose to our aid. Because this is Darren at his core. This is why, when asked to grapple with the complex history of our city's arts, monuments, and markers, the city turned to Darren's sage leadership and wisdom. Darren reminds us that there is no aesthetic, no architectural theory, no trend we can hide behind when confronting our responsibilities as designers. He reminds us that we are what we build, what we leave behind, what communities and ecologies we keep and we strengthen. So I am so grateful for the light of Darren, even as he bears the weight of his own darkest times. In his leadership, in his ministry of justice, he is indefatigable. He guides us to meaning, to reflection, to a call for higher action and a better, fairer world. Because of this, for all of us as architects, as urbanists, as artists, operating in a world of dire, dire need, Darren truly is our North Star. May he glow ever bright, luminous, eponymous, and of course, a vision of sartorial splendor.
So, good evening. Just 2 years ago, 50 years after the Detroit 1967 rebellion was celebrated, I stood in a crowded reception hall at the Detroit Historical Society to welcome Ford Foundation home to Detroit. As Darren announced the opening of their first Detroit office in 40 years, I recall him saying how inspired he was by the air of optimism in the city, and how the people of Detroit appeared to have a boundless capacity to look to the future. Detroit would not be on this extraordinary road of recovery if not for the role that Darren Walker and the Ford Foundation played in what has become known as the Grand Bargain. This is when the Ford Foundation contributed the largest single gift in the history of that foundation, $125 million, as part of a group of funders to help Detroit emerge from bankruptcy in an equitable, just manner that preserved the rights and the pensions of retired city workers while protecting one of our country's great art collections at the Detroit Institute of Art. And that, my friends, was his opening act. When Darren Walker took over the leadership of the Ford Foundation, he stepped into, actually he danced into, the most consequential role that anyone aspiring to dismantle inequality and advocate for social justice could hope to play. Darren has since addressed with elegance and righteous indignation the inequalities that still plague our cities globally and right here at home. Shortly after the Grand Bargain, I began to hear the term the just city, with increasing frequency and urgency. His process of redirecting the national conversation around issues of justice, social equity, housing affordability had begun. Darren Walker believes, as I do, that all citizens have a basic democratic right to live in a socially, economically, and environmentally healthy community, a beloved city where all feel a deep, deep sense of belonging. He inspires, he aspires to construct the just city. Many have the urge to do it, few have the opportunity to act on it. Darren is someone who has acted. He has been a champion of Americans that have faced hardship, discrimination, and injustice. He has also been a player in Detroit. And Detroit, as many of you know, is big, it's black, and it's beautiful. And what more consequential American story is there than the story of Detroit? Combine that aspiration with the recent announcement that Ford, the motor company, would purchase the historic Michigan Central Station, long since vacant and the biggest remaining symbol of the city's decline, with this year's announcement that Henry Ford III would join the foundation board, the first Ford family member to serve in 67 years. Anyone knowledgeable of the complexities of our narrative, of our city, the Ford Motor Company, and the Ford Foundation would understand that we are living through a historic realignment of the city's future, a rebuilding of ties between the city of Detroit and the Ford family. Under Darren's leadership, the Ford Foundation has renewed its commitment to Detroit, recognizing our city as an essential laboratory for tackling inequality in all of its forms. Thanks in part to the Foundation's support, Detroit remains an extraordinary living laboratory in the Foundation's efforts to address racial injustice, economic inequality, and advance democratic participation across the U.S. and around the world. So Darren, I thank you on behalf of all Detroiters and all of us who love cities, and thank you for allowing us to share in your exquisite journey to construct the just city. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Thelma Golden, the director of the Studio Museum in Harlem. And on my way down here, I was about at 94th Street, and I realized I forgot these notes. And I thought, actually, I could keep going, because I could talk about Darren Walker and his incredible impact from my head and my heart every day, all day, because that is what he means to me, and I know so many others in this room. But I did go back up to Harlem and get my notes, and to really be able to say here that as we salute Darren, we are saluting the ways in which he has created so much change in the world and the way in which he's created change for so many of us. I met Darren when he was at the Abyssinian Development Corps in Harlem in the 90s, and I was a curator at the Whitney Museum. And it is through Darren that I began to understand Harlem in its complexity, in its history, but most importantly, in its possibility. Darren saw what others did not see. Darren imagined what could be. Darren invested in what was possible, and that created the ground that I now have the privilege and the pleasure to work in as the leader of the Studio Museum today. And that's because Darren believes deeply in the power of culture. He understands the profound, broad, and bold dynamic impact that culture and art can have on communities and societies. His life has been dedicated to creating engaged, innovative, and impactful change. Recently, Darren's dear friend Ursula Burns described Darren to a room, and she referred to him as an elegant disruptor. And I think that's exactly what he is. Much of what Darren does, of course, comes through the work that he's done at Ford and before Ford at the Rockefeller Foundation and at Abyssinian. But it also comes by the way he lives in the world and through his deep belief in values, which Darren lives so beautifully. Darren believes very deeply, as the Architectural League does, that all decisions about the physical world demand a deep sense of responsibility to the future. He believes in architecture, but not just in buildings. He understands that the built environment is deeply connected to equity. And that sense of equity is what guides his vision for the world. He can envision a better future and then works to actualize it through his intellectual rigor, his enthusiasm, his passion, his dedication, and his constant hard work. His belief in equity for all and the power of culture are evident in his leadership of the Ford Foundation, and very specifically in this moment, evidenced in not only the glorious reimagination of that fantastic Ford Foundation building, but very specifically the role of the art gallery, where in that space, Darren saw the possibility for art to speak to what the Ford Foundation believes through the vision and the voices of artists, artists of color, women artists, artists from around the world, all of whom are speaking to the world as they see it, the world as they imagine it, the world as they are hoping it will and can become. And this is why I am so deeply grateful for Darren, because in his example, what he has done is created a sense of what's possible when we think broadly and deeply about the world changing. He is someone who has done that on an individual scale, because Darren doesn't just invest in things and places, but he invests in people. And that investment in people comes through his professional work, but it also comes through his deep love and friendship. No one is a better cheerleader than Darren Walker. Right? Darren makes you believe that all things are possible. And his own story is one that gives us all inspiration, because Darren has shown what it means to imagine yourself in the world and to use your voice in ways that are productive and deeply powerful. To be with Darren, even for a moment, is to be energized and inspired to be your best self, to be an active citizen, a participant in a global community, a brother or a sister in this vast and diverse human family. It's often said, to whom much is given, much is required. And Darren has not only embodies that, but what he has done with all that he has given is he's opened the doors wide for so many others. He lives a life that is so embodies the power of love and compassion and empathy, and that overflows with generosity and support. He is a shining example of engaged stewardship. We all know that we want to build a better world, and Darren, through his work, his life, and his example, gives us the confidence and drive to turn that desire into meaningful and significant action. So it is a pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to thank Darren for the work, the seeds that he planted in Harlem that I feel privileged to tend today, for the work that he has done throughout this city, throughout this country, and throughout the world, and for the way in which he walks through the world with love, with compassion, but also so significantly with joy. Thank you, Darren.
Use the specifics of the rebirth of the Ford Foundation building as emblematic of Darren's agency. The building's architect, Kevin Roach, before his passing earlier this year, sent a letter to the League about Darren in anticipation of tonight's event. In this letter, he wrote, "It is always worth reflecting upon the fact that without clients, there would be no architecture, and by extension, without great clients, there would be no great architecture." In my career, I've been fortunate to work with many great clients, and Darren holds a special place among them. He is an individual of huge empathy. To be the success that it was, the Ford renovation project demanded masterful dexterity of a client, much more so than building afresh. Darren balanced the need to preserve the history of what our firm, Kevin Roach, John Dinkeloo and Associates, and others were a part of creating while pursuing the needs of the future with a new architect, and he did so with such care. I'm sure my colleagues at Gensler would agree that it is a rare client who can handle an architect as well, so well, but it is the truly exceptional one that would look to handle two. But Darren Walker is not just an exceptional client. He is an inspired leader who is relentlessly optimistic about the ability of places to affect the quality of the activities they form. The Ford Foundation project is not just a meticulous renovation, but a substantial reimagining of the very logic of what the building is. If the way in which we conceive of physical space constructs our social structure, and if the Ford Foundation's new mission, as articulated by Darren's vision, is to target inequality in all of its forms, the building could not just be renovated, not just be brought up to code, not just be made more environmentally efficient, but had to be more radically conceived. Indeed, it had to be renamed, remade as the Ford Foundation's Center of Social Justice. The 20th century hierarchies of power inscribed in the section in the interior, with a very large executive suite hovering above the atrium and a preponderance of private offices, have been transformed into a more egalitarian, transparent, inclusive hub for 21st century collaboration, where accessibility is paramount. The public is invited in, a diverse body of art is given a place in a new gallery, and a substantial amount of space is made available for other nonprofit organizations working for social justice to convene. The strength of Kevin Roach's building is that its extraordinary architecture, its soaring atrium, its transparent skins and singular section enabled its current reincarnation. The genius of Darren's approach is to align then a physical renovation with a more substantial reorganization intrinsically linked to the foundation's purpose. In short, Darren's vision for the foundation's 21st century mission is made manifest in the specifics of what the building does. It doesn't seek to impress, it seeks to inspire, and provides a place for the difficult, daily, collective work of advancing a more equitable world. This building exemplifies Darren's belief in the power of art and architecture, his coupling of a clarity of moral intent with specific action. And this is also evident in his role in public spaces and cities across the country, in Harlem, in Detroit, in New Orleans, and indeed in communities across the globe. In every context, he articulates the basis for, and then inventively works to produce the foundations of a more just society. As Rosalie, Vishaan, Maurice, and Thelma have eloquently argued, at the core, Darren is a moral visionary who leads by example with his humility, his empathy, and his infectious optimism. Please join me in enthusiastically congratulating and celebrating Darren Walker. I now get to read the citation that aligns with the medal. Darren Walker leads by giving forceful voice to our highest aspiration for a just society, in which inequality is challenged at every turn and equity, opportunity, and hope prevail over greed and exclusion. The Architecture League awards its President's Medal to Darren Walker with deep admiration for his clarity, his conviction, his optimism, and the manifold manifestations of his ideas and action in New York and around the world. We celebrate and are inspired by his embrace of the power of architecture in place to communicate values, nurture the soul, excite the spirit, and give form to the empathy that will drive our collective progress. Thank you, Darren. Yes.
Thank you, Paul, for that most generous and kind introduction of me and to my friends, to Maurice and Vishaan and Thelma and Rosalie. My heart is filled tonight with gratitude and a sense of joy upon this special occasion for an award that I really don't feel I'm worthy of. And I feel so thankful that you would all turn out to support this remarkable organization. The work of the League is so critical to the city and to the state and the world. But tonight is really about Kevin, because I want to reflect on this remarkable man called Kevin Roche and recognize his son, Eamon, who is here, and Linda Cinto, who has managed his office for many, many years, because they have been on this journey with me. Since the very first day I met Kevin Roche, I had recently come to the Ford Foundation, and I love the building. I actually never thought I would be at the Ford Foundation. It all happened. It was such a fluke that I ended up at the Ford Foundation, but there I was. And I came off the elevator, and standing there was Kevin Roche. And standing next to him was Ada Louise Huxtable. And it was the first time that they had been together in the Ford building since Kevin walked her through the building as she was preparing to write her dazzling review of the Ford building, which has gone down in the annals of architecture history. And what a gift for me. So of course, I found a way to insinuate myself into their meeting. And imagine experiencing sitting in an office and simply observing what they had to say to each other, as they reminded me of what it was like in 1968 when the Ford building opened, and what a radical idea was embodied in the building. Because it's important to remember that in 1968, the urban landscape looked very different. It was a moment of riots and mayhem, and businesses were scurrying to buy metal gates and steel trap doors to put on the fronts of their businesses to keep away crime and decay and urban dysfunction. And then the Ford Foundation building was presented to the world. Kevin's genius, Dan Kiley's brilliance, in a glass box there in the middle of this little island called Manhattan. And it had a very different sense that was not about an ominous dark time. Their vision was about light and hope and what is possible in the world. And this is what great architecture can do. Give us light and hope and remind us of what is possible in the world. And so, 50 years hence, a new president arrives and is presented with a letter from the city of New York that says, "You're one massive code violation." And how are you going to cure the fact that you've got all sorts of problems with your masterpiece? And the firm of Gensler, Robin Claire Avia, and Maddie Burke appear at my door. And we begin a conversation about how to reimagine this masterpiece for the 21st century and how to bring the values of transparency and openness and optimism to a time that also feels rather dark. And I have to acknowledge all of my friends at Gensler and Raymond Jungles and Siteworks and the Hennigan construction firm, who all labored with such remarkable, extraordinary professionalism and determination, recognizing that they were charged with stewarding a national treasure. I'm so grateful to all of them for helping to bring Kevin's vision forward, being honoring the integrity, the vocabulary, Kevin's original ideas, but brought forward for a new century. And in closing, I would just leave you with the highest compliment, I believe, about architecture. When I was a little boy, we lived in a small town in rural Liberty County, Texas. And we felt very proud because while it was called the Negro community in that county, it was a place on a dirt road, and there were needy, tight shotgun shacks along that road. But what architecture can do, and buildings can do, is to give people who inhabit those buildings, dignity. And I felt as a little boy, when we moved into that little shotgun house that had running water and a bathroom, that for the first time, my family had dignity. And I think about what great architect designed that sturdy, suitable, little shotgun house that lifted me up and made it possible for me to dream and to imagine that I might not always be in a little rural town in East Texas, but that I might come to Gotham one day and actually realize my dreams. This is what architects do. They bring light when they are at their best. And that's what each and every one of you do in your work. And I am so deeply honored and grateful that you would recognize me and the Ford Foundation and Kevin on this very special occasion. Thank you so very much.